Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the History Archive by Noah.beier. This is a new history podcast in which I'm going to be discussing all sorts of events from relative recent history and how they shaped our current world. This show is going to be in a seasonized format. That means there will be several seasons along the way. And in season 1, we are going to be discussing important engineering feats, how they shaped history and our current world especially. We are going to be looking especially at engineering feats from the 20th and late 19th century, that to the relative frame of this season. And today we are going to be starting with an episode about underwater naval warfare. That might sound strange at first, like something that is very far off and distant, that doesn't have anything to do with our current world, but naval policy and warfare has always been a very important part of military history, and it is exceedingly important in our current world. So I think it is a very interesting thing to have a look at how underwater warfare evolved over time. And I'm going to split this theme into 2 episodes. Today is part 1. In 2 weeks we're going to have part 2. This episode will be mainly focusing on the origins of underwater warfare. We're going to be talking about the first ever endeavors into military submarines, and then also what role submarines played in the 2 world wars. And the next episode will then be mainly concerned with the first nuclear submarine in history, the USS Nautilus. And I promise you can already be looking forward to that episode. So with that, the appeal to subscribe to the YouTube channel and the podcast channel wherever you listen to your podcasts. This podcast should be available on all the major podcasting sites like Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say before we get right into the matter of the episode. And I would like to start each episode in the show by presenting a book that helped me research the episode and write the episode. And today I'm going to recommend the book from David Ross, The World's Greatest Submarines. I have left the ISBN number in the show notes together with a link for Amazon, and this is not a paid advertisement, it is just my opinion that I am giving you on a book. Okay. All my other sources that I used have also, of course, in the show notes, and you can click your way through those. So, the first submarine I would like to discuss today is the USS Turtle, built in 1775. It was the first ever submarine to engage in naval combat. She was built during the American War of Independence by the Americans, and she was basically a wine barrel. It was built out of solid oak and had 2 halves. There is also a picture of the turtle in the show notes. The turtle had a container sitting underneath the barrel in which the operator would be sitting, and this container or the tank would be able to flood itself via a hand pump with water, which would provide the ballast for the submarine to sink below the waves. The tank could also be unflooded via the hand pump, and also the movement of the submarine was controlled entirely by hand. The propellers were driven via a foot pedal system, and the depth was also controlled via a vertical propeller, which was also going to be propelled by hand. The critical thing about the Turtle was that it was so small, and as such it didn't contain a lot of oxygen for the operator to breathe, and the oxygen supply was limited to the oxygen that was in the barrel once the hatch was sealed to dive. This would cause a problem for any longer undersea endeavor, as the CO2 level in the vessel would rise over time, and if you breathe too much CO2, that is going to definitely end deadly. So, all these flaws aside, the Turtle attempted an attack on the British warship HMS Eagle. Sergeant Ezra Lee was chosen to pilot the craft, and on the night of the attack, an underwater bomb was going to be attached to the back of the Turtle. It was going to be attached to the hull via a drill, that by the way also would have to be turned by hand, adding to the physical work having to be done by the operator. And the idea was that the bomb would be attached to the hull, and after a time fuse expired, the whole thing would go kaboom, blowing up the ship. Now the trouble was that the operator was unable to attach the bomb to the hull because the drill could not penetrate the underside of the ship. Various reasons are brought up for this. In a documentary that I linked, which is really very good, it is stated that the entire underside of the hull was in fact copper plated. In the book that I recommended earlier, however, it is stated that the sergeant must have only hit a metal strip in the construction for some reason over and over again, and that in fact the rest of the hull was just made out of wood and could have been penetrated easily by the drill. I personally think that the former is far more likely, as I think that the operator would have shifted the craft maybe a yard sideways to attempt drilling in at another spot instead of just trying to always drill in at the same point on the hull. But you may draw your own conclusion on this. Whichever way it happened, the operator was not able to penetrate the hull, and he had to dump the bomb. As I explained earlier, it had a time fuse, so if he didn't get rid of it in time, it would blow up with him. The bomb was ditched, and neither boat engaged in the combat, quote unquote, was damaged. So the first operation of a submarine with a military intent never actually sunk a ship. But it was the first military submarine in the world, so that is definitely an achievement to be made. A side note at this point, the engineer who built the Turtle actually just wanted to build a craft that could carry his underwater mine, the previously referenced bomb that was to be attached to the bottom of the ship. So the Turtle was more or less just a means of getting the underwater bomb to the target. So, what did engineers learn from the turtle? Well, first and foremost, they learned that a craft needs to be more sustainable underwater. It has to stay under for a longer time. This is a problem with the turtle, as it had such small oxygen supply. In fact, there is a experiment that you can see in the National Geographic's documentary that I linked below and have referenced multiple times by now. In this experiment, they placed a volunteer in an airtight box with a home trainer in it, and he performed exercises on it, which would represent the physical strain the operator would be undergoing while he was operating the turtle. And they indeed found out that the operating range of the turtle would be relatively limited. So, of course, engineers would later try to fix this, and nowadays submarines can stay under due to not only their nuclear reactor, but also due to very ingenious devices that can provide submarines with almost indefinite amounts of oxygen, which is really great for a longer operation span. The next submarine that I would like to present also fixed another problem. The Hunley, which was built by the Confederates during the American Civil War, was actually manned by several people, and it had a very long pole in front which carried an underwater bomb, which was similar in conception to that of the turtle, only that it wouldn't be drilled into a hull, but would be rammed in by a steel pike. And it would then be remotely triggered from the Hunley's crew. And this fixed the problem that the turtle had experienced, that it was difficult to actually attack with an underwater bomb. Of course, technology at the time of the turtle had been relatively limited. Now technology had advanced already, because we are by now, of course, in the year 1863 and no longer in the year of 1775. So it's almost 90 years later. The project was difficult, to say the least. It faced quite a lot of adversity from the leadership of the Confederates, especially because it sunk several times before actually sinking a ship. These sinkings all occurred in relatively flat water during testing. In one occasion, one of the crewmen stepped on a lever that would flood the dive tanks, while the vents were still open, drowning several of the crew. And another time, the craft was unable to surface due to getting stuck in the muddy ocean floor, which again killed several of the crew members. This led to the craft being prohibited from diving at all for a while. This was overturned by the commander-in-chief relatively soon, as an important Union ship was spotted in the area, the Heustatic, and this was the first ever ship to be sunk by a submarine. And the submarine was, of course, the Hunley. Unfortunately, the Hunley sunk for a third and final time on her return from sinking the Heustatic, which is very sad because in this event all of her crew members died and went down with their ship. The Honey was raised in the year 2000, and to this day her methods of attack and of operation are still being discovered and studied. For instance, how exactly the bomb was triggered once it had been rammed into the enemy ship. We are going to now fast forward round about 50 years to a point in time where almost every major naval power owned submarines. At this point in time, the United Kingdom had submarines, the Germans had submarines, the Americans had submarines, the Japanese had already made use of submarines, and I believe the Russians also already had submarines at their disposal. The Germans were still lacking behind a little in development because they had started relatively late with their development. At the time, in most naval commands, submarines were still regarded as kind of dirty weapons. A British commander at one point stated that submarines were un-British, in fact, because they were kind of like holding hidden cards of a royal flush at a poker table. So it was kind of respected as a coward's weapon. This was overturned in the British administration by Admiral John Fisher, somebody who we are going to be talking extensively about in another episode that is going to be coming up. And his mindset was, if a ship works to destroy enemy ships, then it is a legitimate design, no matter the moral and ethic code or whatever. That was sort of his mindset, which also led to the development of some very interesting battleships we are going to be discussing in an upcoming episode. So, during the First World War, the German U-9, a submarine that had already been outdated at the time, showed that anti-submarine warfare definitely needed to be upgraded. And this came about because it torpedoed 3 very old British cruisers inside of 2 hours, while staying submerged practically all the time. The 3 ships were very old and should have been scrapped actually by the time of World War I, but because of the desperate need of any available ship, it was manned with reservists who weren't really trained officers, and they were sent to sea. By the time, they were already so damaged and broken that they were unable to upkeep a more or less decent speed, and their maneuverability was also not so great. So the by then standard way of zigzagging to avoid getting torpedoed was also abandoned because of the limitations of the ships at hand. It also did not help that the weather was bad for a couple of days prior, so the ships had already taken a little beating by the weather. The German submarine commander Otto Weding managed something that nobody else had previously, which was to reload a torpedo tube while still submerged underneath the waves. This allowed him to torpedo multiple ships, because the U-9 only had 2 torpedo tubes, and before it was always somehow recognized that you had to surface to reload a torpedo tube, but Captain Weding managed to do it without resurfacing, which was vital because he was always at a very close range to the British ships, and he of course had to fear that he was either going to get rammed or fired upon by the ships if he surfaced. And in fact he did surface for a very short instant after torpedoing the second ship. The recoil of the torpedo getting fired pushed the craft above the waves for a short moment, and one of the remaining ships opened fire, of course, immediately. Captain Weding managed to submerge the ship instantly, and the ship was not lost, and Otto Weding was awarded the Iron Cross in the highest possible category, and the remaining crew the Iron Cross in the second highest category for this remarkable feat, which nobody had thought was even possible. Admiral John Fisher had previously said that submarines and mines posed an existential threat to the British fleet, and he had been mocked in the higher circles of the Navy. Somebody had actually said that mines and submarines were nothing but playthings. This phrase never came up again after a submarine torpedoed 3 cruisers not very far away from the British coast. This shows how valuable a submarine could be. But one submarine is not that much good, and the overall German strategy in World War I was to stop the resupply chain for the war at the Western Front rather. So the Germans devised a strategy where they were going to sink as much resupply ships coming from America with goods for the battlefield to be able to hunger out the Allies in Europe. And for this, they put all their submarines on a sort of blockade line. But this strategy failed because they just could not sink enough ships to stop the success of the Allies in France. The submarines were also mainly held at bay by not sending single freight ships, but sending them in groups, sometimes also escorted with cruisers or destroyers, to ensure their safety from submarines or mines. During the Second World War, the Germans followed a similar strategy, which was mainly due to the fact that the admiral in command of the German Navy was a former submariner. He did not think much of surface fleets, and in fact it was very difficult for the Nazi regime to build up a large surface fleet, especially due to the Versailles Treaty. It was of course also prohibited to build submarines, but then building a submarine is much more easy to hide than building a huge battleship, because submarines are of course much smaller. And the German strategy was to again block the Allied supply chain out of Europe. And the Germans produced huge amounts of submarines to be able to send as much Allied resupply tonnage to the ocean floor. And this time, instead of letting single submarines attack the American convoys or British convoys That is why I mysteriously said that one single submarine is not much good earlier. The Germans let a series of submarines attack together in wolf packs. The idea was that a single submarine, if it discovered a convoy, would not immediately start an attack alone, but it would radio headquarters, and headquarters would then send out several other submarines, and then they would formate around what was then called the point submarine, and then they would gather around the convoy and then attack in a coordinated strike upon the convoy. This allowed them to negate the actual supremacy of the destroyers and cruisers, who were at all times protecting the freight ships. The only problem was that all these attacks were, of course, coordinated over radio. And, of course, the radio was not unencrypted. Most of you will probably have heard of the Enigma code. And all these commands and coordinates were sent via the Enigma. Now, at one point, the British managed to salvage an Enigma and, almost more importantly, the Enigma codebook from the sinking submarine U-559 on the 30th of October in 1942. And from then on, they could listen to the German radio traffic and could determine which convoys were about to get attacked. This was, of course, a huge advantage then for the British anti-submarine warfare, because then they could drop depth charges at a known target and weren't just firing ammunition at something they didn't even know if it was there. Of course, also other technologies influenced the anti-submarine war. Technologies like the radar and sonar, which allowed them to detect submarines under the waves and above the waves. And of course, technologies like the frequency detection, where you basically determine where a signal is coming from. Even if you can't encrypt it, you can estimate where its sender is more or less located, which is also, of course, very valuable because the German submarines were in constant contact with headquarters, which was also, of course, an advantage if you own this kind of technology. And another problem plagued the German submarines. At the time, submarines were driven by diesel engines. And not only did you have to resurface relatively frequently to recharge the batteries at the surface, because you can't use a diesel engine underwater because you need air for running a diesel engine. You have to suck in air to the carburetor to then create the what we call the air-fuel mixture, and underwater there is, of course, no air. So the submarines had to resurface to recharge their batteries while their diesel engines were running, and then the full batteries would be used to drive electric motors once you were submerged. This had to occur around about every 48 hours. And then the batteries would be entirely drained, which was not the target. Usually you had to resurface after 24 hours, so that in the event of a sudden airstrike, you could dive quickly and also remain under the surface. If your batteries were entirely empty, then you had zero mobility under the waves, which was, of course, very critical. So, this was one problem, but the other problem was you didn't have an infinite supply of diesel. The diesel tanks on board were, of course, limited, so you had to return to base to get refueling. This was of course extremely suboptimal if you were in the middle of a wolf pack hunt. So the Germans came up with a very smart idea. They built the so-called milk cows. These were basically a standard U-boat of the time for the Germans, where they added extra fuel tanks on the outside and replaced the torpedo tubes and took off basically all the armament except a anti-ship gun and a flak gun. And these milk cows were basically refueling and replenishing submarines. They carried extra torpedoes to resupply other U-boats. They carried, of course, extra fuel. That was what the extra fuel tanks were for. They even carried extra crew members to replace injured or killed crew members on other ships. And the rendezvous with other U-boats with the milk cow were always predetermined by headquarters, and as you can guess, the coordinates and all the relevant information were sent over the Enigma. And the Enigma code was cracked, as I iterated earlier. So the Allies decided that as they now knew where the milk cows would rendezvous with their counterparts, it was of course of very high relevance to sink the milk cows, because that would then limit the operating range of all the other U-boats in the Atlantic Ocean, which then would allow for the supply chain of ships coming from America to be kept upright. So the Allies started attacking the milk cow rendezvous, especially as these could not dive while the fuel line was connected. Neither submarine could dive, and especially not the milk cow, because it took relatively long for milk cows to submerge. So there was a standard order that a U-boat that was on a rendezvous with a milk cow was not allowed to dive until the milk cow had dived to safety. The very cruel calculation here was that if you lose a normal U-boat, that is not as bad as losing an entire milk cow. Because the Germans, as I said earlier, had vast amounts of submarines, and if you lost one, that wasn't as tragic as losing one of only 10 milk cows. Only 10 milk cows were built, and all 10 were sunk by 1943. So this was of course a lesson for engineers working on submarines. In case of a large naval war, you need a submarine that doesn't need refueling, that doesn't have to be dependent on a supply chain that can be intercepted and destroyed. You need a submarine that can work independently for a couple of months and that can go to the remotest places of the world without having to worry of running out of fuel. And at the same time, during the Second World War, in Los Alamos, on the Manhattan Project, scientists were designing the nuclear bomb. And in that lab there was also a man called Enrico Fermi, and he had built a nuclear reactor. This nuclear reactor was still very weak. It could only run one simple light bulb, but if you could power a light bulb, there was a potential to upgrade the system to power a submarine, maybe. Interesting prospects. So that is what we're going to be discussing in the next episode of the History Archive, how engineers managed to use the incredible power of the splitting of the uranium atom to power their fleet of nuclear submarines during the Cold War, and especially what that had for a geopolitical impact. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope that you have a good week, and I hope to see you in the next episode of the History Archive. My name is Noah Beier. Bye.